In a quiet neighborhood, an elderly black woman living alone, known for always cooking for her neighbors, led a quiet but warm life. One rainy night, she opened her door to a 10-year-old boy, shivering and bruised, running from an abusive stepfather. She didn't ask questions, just brought him in, fed him, protected him, and called the police. Years later, that same boy, now a federal judge, returned to repay her and asked to call her mom. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thoughts. In the quiet corner of a Georgia neighborhood where porches creaked with time and magnolia trees bowed gently over cracked sidewalks, there stood a modest little house at the end of Willow Street. It wasn't grand nor freshly painted, but it had something no real estate agent could list: a soul. The walls, though worn, had soaked in decades of laughter, gospel music, and the sweet scent of baked cornbread that seemed to hover around the windows like a welcome mat in the air. This was the home of Mama Jo. Mama Jo wasn't anyone famous. She didn't hold degrees on her wall or drive anything newer than her weathered Ford pickup that wheezed on cold mornings. But everyone on Willow Street and beyond knew her. Some called her the porch saint. Others simply called her Mama. She had a way about her, the kind that made you feel like you belonged, even if you were just passing by. Mama Jo was 50 years old, though you'd never hear her say it out loud. Age was something she wore not as a burden, but like an old quilt, faded in places, patched with memory, but still warm and beautiful. She lived alone, not by misfortune, but by quiet choice. Her husband had passed decades ago, and her children were scattered across states and cities, tied up in jobs, families, and lives of their own. But Mama Jo never let loneliness find a place to sit in her house. Her table was always set for more than one. Strangers became neighbors, neighbors became family, and family, well, she never let go of family, not really. That day had been like any other. A golden light spilled across her garden where tomatoes climbed fences and collard greens reached for the sky. She hummed a hymn as she stirred a pot of gumbo, thick and fragrant, every motion of her hand a quiet ritual of love. The radio crackled in the corner, half playing Louis Armstrong, half static, but she liked it that way. She moved slowly now. Age had taken its share, but her heart beat as young and fierce as it ever did. It was the kind of evening where nothing felt urgent. Children rode bikes home, porch lights flickered on like fireflies waking up, and somewhere a dog barked once and then quieted. Mama Jo had just pulled a skillet of cornbread from the oven, its crust a perfect golden brown, when she heard it. The sound. Soft, hesitant, barely more than a whisper of a knock. She paused. Not many people came by this late. She wiped her hands on her apron, heart not racing but aware. The kind of awareness only women like Mama Jo understood. Those who'd seen enough to know that sometimes trouble didn't shout. Sometimes it barely breathed. She opened the door, and everything she thought she knew about peace shifted. Standing there was a boy, no more than 10, soaked from the drizzle that had begun to fall. Arms folded tightly across his chest, shivering not just from cold, but from something deeper. His skin was pale beneath bruises, one eye puffed just slightly, the kind of wound you don't get from tripping on a step. His lips were cracked, his clothes too thin for the evening air. But what broke her most was the way he looked at her, not with fear, but with exhaustion. Like someone who had run too far for too long and wasn't sure if he'd been running toward hope or away from despair. He didn't say much, just 4 words: "Please don't make me go." And Mama Jo, without hesitation, reached out her hand, not with questions, not with conditions, but with the certainty of someone who knew that love didn't ask for explanation. She took him in, closed the door, and just like that, a new chapter began, not just for the boy, but for the 72-year-old woman who had always believed that the front door was never meant to be a barrier, but a bridge. The door clicked shut behind them with a soft finality, the kind that separates one world from another. Inside Mama Jo's kitchen, the warm amber light seemed to wrap itself around the boy like a shawl. The scent of cornbread and simmering gumbo filled the air, grounding the moment with a sense of home, even as silence hung heavy between them. He stood in the entryway, dripping a small puddle onto the faded linoleum, arms still crossed, eyes darting to corners like he expected someone to leap out from the shadows. Mama Joe didn't rush him. At 72, she knew the value of silence and the weight of it. She simply turned toward the stove, pulled a clean dish towel from the drawer, and set it gently on the table before ladling soup into a wide ceramic bowl. "I made this with okra and smoked sausage," she said softly, not looking directly at him. "It's got a little heat, but it's real kind to the belly." She placed the bowl down, added a thick slice of cornbread still warm from the oven, and stepped back like a host giving space to a guest who hadn't yet decided if he was staying. The boy didn't move at first. Then, cautiously, like a stray animal testing trust, he approached the table. His fingers trembled as he reached for the spoon. The first bite came slowly, almost suspiciously, but the second came faster. He didn't speak, but his body did, the sag of his shoulders, the way his breathing slowed, the flicker of disbelief that someone had made something just for him. Mama Joe watched from the sink, quietly wiping a plate that didn't need drying, eyes never leaving him. The bruises on his arm, just beneath the sleeve of his soaked t-shirt, told more story than his mouth could bear. She'd seen enough in her years, seen what people didn't want to talk about, what the law sometimes missed, and what children were forced to endure in silence. When he finished, he looked up at her for the first time, and in his eyes she saw the question he was too scared to ask. "Am I safe here?" She nodded, as if answering a prayer instead of a glance. "You got a name, baby?" Her voice was velvet but firm, the kind of voice that didn't take offense when met with quiet. The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Nathan." It came out hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while, or maybe he'd learned to stop saying it when no one used it kindly. Mama Joe repeated it back like it was sacred. "Nathan," she said, smiling gently. "That's a strong name. Strong like roots." He nodded once, eyes flickering down, voice barely audible. "Please don't call nobody. I'll be good. I can't go back." And there it was. The plea beneath the silence, the terror wrapped in obedience. Mama Joe stepped forward slowly, reached into the drawer by the fridge and pulled out a faded Afghan blanket. She laid it over his shoulders with the kind of care that made him flinch. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. "I ain't sending you back, sugar," she said calmly. "Not tonight, not ever to danger. But I do have to call someone who can help you the right way. You're safe here till then, you hear me?" His lip quivered at that, and for the first time a tear slipped down his cheek. It didn't fall with a sob. It just rolled, silently, like it had been waiting for permission. Mama Joe cupped his cheek gently, her thumb brushing away the tear with all the reverence of a mother tucking in her child. She left him at the table and stepped into the next room, picking up the rotary phone that clicked with each turn of the dial. Her voice was steady as she gave her name and address to the local police dispatch, instructing that an officer trained in child welfare respond and that no uniforms or flashing lights disturb the child who'd just begun to breathe again. By the time she returned, Nathan was curled on her couch, wrapped in the Afghan, the empty soup bowl resting carefully on the coffee table beside him. He was already dozing, the kind of sleep that only comes after long, hard fear. Mama Joe sat beside him, not saying a word, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her presence a silent promise. She knew the system didn't always get it right, but until the morning came and someone knocked with answers, she would hold the night like a shield around this boy and make sure, for once in his life, he was not alone. The hours passed quietly, wrapped in the soft ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional groan of wind brushing against the windows. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper, the kind that barely kissed the porch steps but left the air thick with memory. Inside, Mama Joe didn't sleep. She sat in her worn armchair across from the couch, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes never left Nathan. There was something sacred about watching over someone who didn't yet know how to ask for protection. She had done it before, fostered, fed, and held too many broken pieces in her lifetime, but this boy had walked in with a silence that shouted, and a stillness that trembled beneath every breath. At dawn, when the light pressed gently through the lace curtains, she finally heard the knock. It was firm, not aggressive, and when she opened the door it was just as she'd asked. No sirens, no uniforms, no floodlights. A woman stood there, mid-40s maybe, hair pulled back, clipboard in hand, eyes calm but alert. Her name was Mrs. Raymond, a caseworker with the Department of Family and Children's Services. She spoke in low tones, respectful ones, and Mama Joe appreciated that. Nathan was still asleep on the couch, curled in the blanket like it was a cocoon. They sat in the kitchen, just out of earshot, drinking weak coffee and sharing hard truths. Mama Joe described the bruises, the fear in the boy's eyes, the way he flinched at kindness. Mrs. Raymond nodded slowly, taking notes with a mechanical pencil that scratched softly against her clipboard. "He's run before," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. But this time someone actually opened the door. When the time came to wake him, Mama Joe did it herself. She sat beside him, laid a hand gently on his shoulder, and whispered his name like a lullaby in reverse. He stirred, eyes blinking open with the panic of someone expecting to be snatched away. But then he saw her, just her, and the fear eased, not gone, but quieter. "Nathan, baby," she said softly, "there's a kind lady here who wants to help. She ain't gonna hurt you, but we need to talk about what happens next." He sat up slowly, arms wrapped tight around his knees. He didn't look at Mrs. Raymond, just at Mama Joe. "Do I have to leave?" The question wasn't said with rebellion. It was quiet, defeated, like he already knew the answer and was bracing for the ache of it. Mama Joe took his small hand in hers, her thumb tracing slow circles across his knuckles. "Not right now, and not to where you came from. That ain't ever happening again, you hear me?" Mrs. Raymond knelt beside them, her tone professional but laced with real warmth. "Nathan, we're going to find a safe place for you, a foster home where you'll be taken care of. But for the next few days, if it's all right with Miss Josephine, you can stay right here while we work through the details." Mama Joe didn't flinch at the use of her full name. She nodded once firmly. "He's got a room already," she said, even though she hadn't cleaned it out in years. It had once belonged to her nephew, but the bed was still there and the quilt still fresh with lavender soap. "And I got groceries enough for a week. Don't need no government check. Just need to know he's not going back to hell." Nathan blinked at that, something between disbelief and hope flickering in his eyes. Mama Joe helped him off the couch, led him to the spare room with its soft yellow walls and faded baseball posters, and told him he could unpack his heart here, one piece at a time. Later that morning she took him shopping, not for toys she wasn't one to spoil, but for socks without holes, a toothbrush of his own, and a second-hand denim jacket he picked out with a grin so small it barely counted as a smile. But Mama Joe saw it. She noticed everything. Over the next few days he thawed, not all at once, and not without shadows. He had nightmares, clenched his fists when people walked too fast, and sometimes forgot to speak at all. But each time he broke, Mama Joe was there to hold the edges until he could be whole again. She taught him how to stir roux without burning it, how to shell peas with patience, and how to read the weather by the way the wind rustled through the trees. In return he began to trust, not with words but with actions, the way he'd set the table without being asked, or the way he leaned his head lightly against her shoulder during gospel hour on Sunday afternoons. And when Mrs. Raymond returned a week later with news of an available foster placement, Nathan didn't cry, but his hands shook as he packed his things. A few clothes, a book Mama Joe gave him, and the small notebook she tucked under his pillow. On the first page, in her careful, looping handwriting, she had written, "You are seen, you are safe, you are somebody." He stood by the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes on the porch steps. "Will I see you again?" he asked, and Mama Joe, 72 years strong and still undefeated by time, reached out and cupped his cheek. "You will, baby. I'll be right here, and you come back when you're ready. This door don't close on people who need love." He nodded, lips pressed tight, and followed Mrs. Raymond down the walkway. Mama Joe watched them disappear around the corner, her hand resting lightly on the frame of the open door. The house was quiet again, but something had shifted. Something alive had taken root, and though she couldn't know it then, The seed she planted in that boy, through soup and silence and the simple act of seeing him, was already growing, reaching for something far beyond Willow Street. The days that followed Nathan's departure stretched long and slow, the way time does when something dear has been taken but not truly lost. Mama Jo returned to her routines: early mornings with gospel radio, biscuits in the oven by 7, tending her garden in the afternoons. But the quiet inside her home had changed its shape. It wasn't loneliness exactly, she had lived alone for years, but now the silence echoed with memories. A child's footsteps padding softly across hardwood floors, the sound of silverware clinking gently in a bowl, the low murmur of a boy trying to read aloud. Meanwhile, Nathan's path turned down a road lined with uncertainty. The foster home was safe, at least on the surface. Clean clothes, steady meals, a bedroom of his own, but nothing tasted like Mama Jo's gumbo, and no one said his name with the softness she had. His new guardians were kind but distant, doing their best through the thick fog of the system. School was worse. He was quiet, out of step, often alone. Other kids teased his silence, misunderstood it as arrogance or awkwardness. He read her words every morning before homeroom, fingers tracing the ink like it was holy script. You are seen, you are safe, you are somebody. That single page became his compass. It didn't fix everything, not at first, but it steadied him. In middle school, he joined the debate team, surprising even himself. He discovered that words could be armor, logic a kind of sword. In high school, he won state competitions. He graduated top of his class. On scholarship, he walked into college determined not just to succeed, but to build something bigger than himself. Years passed like chapters in a well-worn book. Nathan went on to law school, clerking under respected judges, volunteering for youth defense programs, carrying within him the sacred duty of protection. He still had no parents of record, no legacy handed down through blood, but he carried Mama Jo's words like inheritance. For Mama Jo, life slowed with grace. Her hands became stiffer, her steps more deliberate, but her fire never dimmed. Children still knocked on her door for Sunday treats. Teenagers still sought her advice when the world outside their windows spun too fast. She never once locked her door. She never once stopped listening. She never once stopped believing that one act of mercy could change the whole arc of a person's life. And though she didn't know it yet, not in full, not with clarity, her name was already being spoken in places she'd never imagined. In classrooms and courtrooms, whispered in stories and speeches by a man she'd once fed soup and wrapped in an Afghan. Mama Jo had believed in him before he knew how to believe in himself. And that kind of belief, once planted, doesn't just grow. It blooms into legacy. It was a spring morning, crisp and clear, the kind of morning where everything felt newly washed by rain and promises hung soft in the air. Mama Jo sat at her kitchen table, same place as always, steam rising from her cup of chicory coffee, her hands wrapped gently around the warmth. She moved slower now, her joints ached more often than not, and her breath sometimes came in little huffs when she climbed the porch steps, but she refused to let age make her small. The world had changed around her. Neighbors moved, kids grew up, stores closed and reopened as something else, but she remained rooted, like the oak tree in her yard whose branches reached farther even as its trunk weathered. That morning she was sorting through a stack of old envelopes. Some were bills, some were circulars she'd never read, but one caught her eye, a thick, cream-colored envelope with no return address, just her name, written in the same clean handwriting she hadn't seen in person for years but could recognize blindfolded. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet, folded crisply. At the top, embossed in deep blue ink, were the words, United States District Court. She paused. Her breath caught. Below that, a letter, brief but saturated with something heavy and holy. Dearest Mama Jo, tomorrow I am being sworn in as a federal judge. There will be cameras, reporters, speeches. I have been asked to speak about my journey, to tell the story that led me to this bench. I will, But I wanted you to have these words first, because none of that, the title, the robe, the law, is mine without you. You saw me when I was invisible. You fed me when I was starving for more than food. You gave me a name worth answering to. You are the reason I stand where I do, not as a survivor, but as a man who belongs. And tomorrow, when they ask me who helped build me, I will say your name out loud so the world will know it too. I love you, Mama. Always have. Always will. Your son, Nathan. The letter trembled in her hand as she laid it on the table. Her eyes, now moist with the weight of memory, drifted to the window. She didn't need anything else in that moment, not applause, not awards, not parades. Her heart was full in a way that left no room for regret. She had always believed in the small things. Warm meals, listening ears, a place to rest your feet. And now one of those small things had grown into something mighty. She could see Nathan in her mind, tall and sure, standing in front of a room full of people who would hang on every word he spoke, unaware that the strongest thing in that room was a memory of an old woman in Georgia who once poured soup into a chipped bowl and said, "You're safe now." And then came the broadcast. It was aired nationally, streamed online, shared across feeds and headlines. Mama Jo didn't own a computer, but her neighbor's son, Jamal, brought over his laptop and set it up right on her coffee table. "You need to see this, Miss Jo," he said, smiling like he was in on a secret that was about to bloom. She sat upright, hands clasped as the screen flickered and a seal appeared. The seal of the United States District Court. Then Nathan appeared, older now, elegant in his black robe, shoulders broad, voice as deep and steady as gospel. His speech began with the usual honors, the expected nods. But then, without pause or shame, he told them about her. He told them about a night long ago when a broken boy knocked on a stranger's door and was met not with suspicion, but with soup and silence and love. He told them her name, Josephine Bellamy. Mama Jo to everyone who knew her, the woman who didn't save my life once, she saved it every day after by reminding me that I mattered. The camera caught murmurs in the crowd, some people blinking back tears. Nathan went on, his voice unwavering. We speak of justice like it's an institution. But for me, justice began with a 72-year-old woman's hands holding mine steady over a pot of gumbo. She taught me what dignity looked like, what mercy sounded like, and what it meant to belong. Mama Jo said nothing, not even when her name rang out in that marble courtroom. She just sat quietly, her hand resting on her chest, as if trying to hold in the swell of something larger than breath. The neighbor boy sniffled. "You're famous now," he teased, and she smiled softly. "Baby," she whispered, "I've been famous to the only heart that ever mattered." But Nathan wasn't done. The next morning, while dew still clung to the grass and birds called from the trees, a car pulled into her driveway, a sleek black sedan, windows tinted, quiet as a whisper. The door opened, and there he was. Taller, grayer at the temples, but still Nathan, still hers. She opened the screen door before he even knocked. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked up the steps, wrapped his arms around her fragile frame, and held on like he was anchoring himself to the earth. "I came home," he murmured. "I'm not here to visit, Mama. I'm here to stay. If you'll have me, I want to take care of you now." And just like that, without fanfare, the door that had once opened to save a boy now opened again to welcome home a man who had kept his promise, a man who had never forgotten the hand that fed him not just food, but hope. And Mama Jo, now older than most ever make it, leaned into his embrace and whispered, "Took you long enough, baby." One evening, the sky glowing pink with the hush of dusk, Nathan found her resting in her rocker, wrapped in a soft quilt she'd sewn years ago, her breath slow, her smile barely visible beneath gently closed eyes. The jasmine outside the window had begun to bloom early that year, and its scent drifted through the cracked pane like a memory returning home. Nathan sat beside her, a quiet reverence in every motion, and took her hand, feeling how fragile she'd become, how time had thinned her skin but never her spirit. He didn't speak right away. He just watched her, memorizing the angle of her jaw, the silver waves of her hair, the soft rhythm of her chest. Then, with a voice both steady and full of ache, he said, "Mama, I've been thinking. It's not enough for me to visit, not any more." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and she smiled when she saw him. Not surprised, not startled, just peaceful, like she already knew what he was about to say. "I'm here now," he continued, his voice low, "and I want to make it official. I know I'm grown, but I want you to be my mother. Not just in my heart, in name, in everything." Her eyes shimmered then, not with shock, but with something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, a love so old it didn't need words to rise. Her hand gripped his just a little tighter, her thumb tracing his knuckles like she'd done when he was a boy too scared to sleep. "You always were my son," she whispered, barely louder than the creak of the floorboards. "From the moment you knocked, baby." Nathan leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a promise sealed not in ceremony but in blood that had nothing to do with lineage. That night, under the same roof where their story began, Nathan filed the paperwork that would make it true on paper, what had long been true in spirit. He signed her name with reverence, Josephine Bellamy, now his mother by choice. She didn't need the legal title, but he gave it anyway, not to change who she was, but to honor her for all she'd always been, and from that moment forward he called her Mama with no hesitation, no explanation, just truth. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.